My three judges ready. Your timer? And the affirmative team take it. And run one. Right. If it is not necessary to change, it is necessary not to change. What I'm going to do in this first negative rebuttal is refute the arguments made in the 2AC against my original arguments, and I'll be showing you how there's actually no need in the status quo to do the affirmative plan. And even if you did choose to do the affirmative plan, it wouldn't solve for anything. We're going to start with the issue of funding. Now, the affirmative team talked about how it's only going to cost $2 billion, and then in cross-examination, I asked, why hasn't the United States done it yet? They responded, for issues of funding. So my response to the argument of funding is that of a reason for delay. A reason for delay. There is a specific reason the United States government has decided not to, first of all, pay the cost to destroy these ones, and second of all, pay the cost to make the new ones the affirmative team is talking about, and that is that of cost. Now, this is very relevant when talking about the debt ceiling that we have recently reached, as my partner talked about in his last speech. So the funding by the affirmative team isn't actually there, and the United States government has decided to delay the upgrading because of the debt ceiling and because of the costs it would be. Now we'll take a look at the issue of Solvency I, of international stockpiles. The affirmative had two main responses. They first talked about how this doesn't matter. My response is international countries are using. International countries are using. Now the funny thing is that the countries that are actually using the cluster munitions are the countries my piece of evidence mentions. That is Brazil, China, India, Israel, Pakistan, and Russia. But the fact is that Russia hasn't used these since 2008. So the countries that are actually using these cluster munitions aren't affected by the affirmative team's plan. The piece of evidence clearly showed these. And as we see from historical precedents, the United States and Russia haven't been using these recently. So the countries that the affirmative team actually affects under a plan are irrelevant, because the countries that they don't affect are the ones that are posing this threat of the cluster munitions, because they're actually using them. So this does actually have an impact to the affirmative case, because they can't solve for the harm of the cluster munitions being used, because where they're being used is countries where they don't do anything about it. They also talked about how we can pressure these other countries to ratify this convention, as well as Russia. My response is effectiveness unproven. Effectiveness unproven. All they stated was that, well, we can try and pressure these countries. However, the effectiveness of this pressure has been unproven by the affirmative team. They haven't had any evidence to actually back this up, to give us an actual reason why, in fact, this would be so. Now we'll take a look at Solvency Point 2 of whether or not Russia would actually do this. Their response was a piece of evidence from Human Rights Watch in 2009, talking about how Russia would be willing to do something under the Geneva Convention. I have three responses. My first, not specific. Not specific. The piece of evidence by the affirmative team never mentioned the cluster munitions the affirmative team is talking about. It was very vague in general in talking about the issue of cluster munitions and wasn't specific to the affirmative team's plan. So the affirmative has failed to provide this. My second response is no action taken. No action taken. If Russia really wanted to get rid of their cluster munitions, they would have done something. They would have started to upgrade them. The thing is, Russia has not done this, therefore will not do it. And my third response is relational context. Relational context. Now, I talked about this a little bit in cross-examination. Back in 2009, when this quote was written, the United States-Russian relationship was very, very strong. We had just pressed the reset button, which is a policy by President Obama to reset the relations, and our relations were good. Now, the affirmative team admitted that right now our relationship is very bad. I read a piece of evidence from yesterday about how terrible our relationship is. So we have to look at this piece of evidence through the context of the relationship. Back in 2009, when the relationship between the United States and Russia was very strong, Russia said they may be willing to do something with the United States on cluster munitions. Now, in 2011, the situation is different, there's a lack of trust, and the relationship is very, very bad right now, and Russia will not ratify this agreement, given the context of the relationship is very, very different, and Russia doesn't trust the United States. So the impact of this solvency is that Russia won't actually ratify the affirmative case, therefore their advantages, their justifications won't actually come about, because the treaty will not even go into effect. Let's take a look at the issue of Solvency III, that is enforcement. They talked about how Russia would comply. I have two responses. First, or actually I only have one response. We're going to conserve this so I can get some more arguments. My response is that there's still no verification or enforcement. It doesn't matter whether or not Russia does it. It matters whether or not we can tell if they've done it. And the affirmative team hasn't even proven us with a way that their treaty can actually tell whether or not Russia has done it. This isn't actually a response to my argument. My argument was that we can't tell whether or not Russia was doing it, not whether or not Russia would do it. We have to know whether or not we have to have enforcement and verification, and the affirmative plan, the affirmative treaty doesn't provide it. Then the issue of whether or not we're using these cluster munitions right now and that they're out of use. The affirmative team said, first of all, that we have no evidence that they're out of use. I was referring to the affirmative evidence that the last time the United States used cluster munitions was in 2009. They also said that under the issue of clearance required, they said that we still have the cluster munitions. My response is that the threat of cluster munitions is that they are not cleared from the field. And the status quo clears these cluster munitions from the field and removes any threat they may have. I ask you to stand with me and negate the resolution. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure speaking for you in today's debate round.